The cabin had been hers for 11 days when the black SUV turned off the logging road and crunched slowly up the gravel drive. Theodora Blaine was on the porch with her coffee going cold in her hands, watching the morning mist lift off Raven Lake when she heard it. She didn't move right away. Up here, in a place called Dunmore's Landing, a dot on the map halfway between Sudbury and nowhere, unexpected vehicles usually meant lost hunters or someone who'd missed the turn to the provincial park. She waited. The SUV stopped, the engine cut. A man got out, and even from 40 feet away she could tell he was wrong for this place. The coat too clean, the shoes too deliberate, the way he looked at the cabin like he was checking it against a photograph in his head. He was. He pulled out his phone, looked at something on the screen, looked up at the cabin, looked at the screen again. Then he looked at her. "I think there's been a mistake," he said. Theodora set her mug on the porch railing. "That seems possible," she said. "What kind of mistake?" His name was Conrad Halsey. She found that out in the first 3 minutes, along with the fact that he had booked this cabin. Lot 14C, Raven Lake Road, through a rental agency in Toronto for the month of October, had the confirmation email, had the check-in instructions, and had driven 4 hours from the city to be here. She had also booked this cabin, through the same agency, for the same month. They stood in the kitchen. She'd let him in because it was cold, and because she was, at her core, a person raised by a woman who believed rudeness was a form of cowardice. And they both looked at their phones, at the confirmation numbers that were different, but the property address that was identical, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "I'll call the agency," he said. "I already tried," she said. "Yesterday when the Wi-Fi password they gave me didn't work. I was on hold for 40 minutes, and then the line dropped." She paused. "Their office hours are 9 to 5 Eastern. It's currently 7:42. He looked at her. He had one of those faces that was very controlled, not unfriendly exactly, but arranged, like someone who had learned early that expressions cost something. "You've been here since when?" 11 days. A small shift in his jaw. She filed it away. "Right," he said. He looked around the kitchen, the herbs she'd hung to dry in the window, the stack of marked-up manuscripts on the table, the daughter's drawing of a bear taped to the fridge door with electrical tape, because she'd forgotten to bring magnets. "And you're here alone?" "My daughter is asleep upstairs," Theodora said. "She's 7. Her name is Willa." She paused. "Not that her name is relevant. I wasn't." He stopped. Started again. "I'm not suggesting you leave." "Good," she said. "Because I'm not." She had come to Dunmore's Landing the way people come to places they didn't entirely plan, following the shape of a need they couldn't quite name. 8 months out from the end of her marriage. 14 months out from the manuscript that had stalled so completely. She sometimes opened the file just to stare at the cursor blinking in the middle of a sentence she'd abandoned in February. Her editor had been gentle about it for a long time. In September, the gentleness had worn through. "Take the cabin," her friend Bex had said, over the phone from her kitchen in Halifax. "My cousin owns it. It's empty until November. Take Willa and go north and just be in a place where you don't have to be you for a little while." She had wanted to point out that you couldn't stop being yourself by geographic relocation. But she had also been very tired, and Willa had been asking for weeks why Mummy looked like that, and she hadn't had a good answer. So she'd packed the car and driven north, and the trees had gotten taller, and the roads had gotten quieter, and somewhere past the last Tim Hortons she'd actually exhaled for the first time in what felt like most of a year. The cabin had no cell service to speak of, and the Wi-Fi was broken, and the dock had a soft board that she'd learned the hard way to step over. It was exactly what she needed. And now there was a man from Toronto in her kitchen. Conrad Halsey reached the agency at 9:15. Theodora sat at the table with her manuscript open in front of her, not reading it, while she listened to his half of the call from across the room. He had a low voice and he used fewer words than she expected. She found herself cataloguing this the way she catalogued everything. Occupational habit, her ex-husband used to call it, and not always kindly. "What do you mean the unit isn't double booked?" she heard him say. Then, "I understand that. What I'm asking is," a pause. "No, I'm not interested in a refund. I'm asking you to explain how 2 people have valid confirmations for the same property." Willa came downstairs at 9:30 in her socks, stopped dead in the kitchen doorway, and stared at Conrad Halsey with the total frankness of a child who has not yet learned to soften her reactions. "You're very tall," Willa said. Conrad looked at her. Something happened in his face, a brief involuntary loosening like a door coming unstuck. "I know," he said. "It's inconvenient." Willa appeared to consider this seriously. "Do you hit your head on things?" "Sometimes. Our neighbor at home is tall and she hits her head on our garage door every time she comes over." Willa climbed onto a chair and reached for the box of cereal Theodora had left on the table. "Mummy, is the man staying?" Theodora looked at Conrad Halsey. Conrad Halsey looked at Theodora. "We're figuring that out," Theodora said. The agency's position, once Conrad had been transferred twice and finally reached someone with authority, was that a clerical error had resulted in 2 confirmation numbers being issued for Lot 14C, and that they were terribly sorry, and that they could offer a partial refund to one party and rebook the other at a comparable property. Available properties in the area being limited in late October, the comparable property being a motel in Chelmsford, 40 minutes south, which Theodora had Googled and which appeared in the photographs to have a strong institutional smell. Conrad relayed all of this standing at the kitchen counter. Then he said, "I told them to keep the refund. I'm not driving to Chelmsford." Theodora looked out the window at the lake. The mist had burned off. The water was the color of pewter, very still. On the far bank, a stand of birches had gone gold almost overnight. She'd woken up 2 days ago, and there they were, as if someone had turned a light on inside them. "There are 2 bedrooms, she said, before she entirely decided to say it. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm aware that's a reasonable solution," he said. "I also understand if you'd rather I find somewhere else." She turned back from the window. He was watching her with that careful face, not pushing, just waiting. She thought about the motel in Chelmsford. She thought about the birches. She thought about the fact that Willa had already asked him 3 follow-up questions about height, and he'd answered all of them without checking his phone once. "The second bedroom is small," she said. "There's a quilt that smells like cedar. The window sticks." "That's fine," he said. "I work in the mornings. Willa watches a show on the tablet from 7 to 8. If you need quiet, that's your window. I usually run in the mornings. There's a trail that starts at the end of the drive, goes up to a ridge. 40 minutes out, 40 back." He nodded. Something in his posture shifted. Not relaxed exactly, but less braced, as if he'd been expecting her to make this harder than it was. "I'll stay out of your way," he said. She almost said "you don't have to," and then didn't, because it was too early for that, and she wasn't sure what she meant by it anyway. "Good," she said instead. "I'll make more coffee." The first few days were careful. They moved around each other in the cabin the way people move around furniture in a room they're still learning. Measuring, adjusting, finding the paths that worked. He was up before her in the mornings, back from his run by the time she came downstairs, coffee already made. He used the table in the corner by the window for whatever it was he was doing on his laptop. She used the table in the center. They did not discuss this. It simply became the arrangement. Willa, who had no interest in arrangements, distributed herself evenly across both their orbits. She showed Conrad where the softboard was on the dock, in a tone of great seriousness, as though she was conveying intelligence vital to his survival. She reported to Theodora at dinner that Conrad had explained to her how wolves navigate using the Earth's magnetic field, and that she had told him about her class project on the life cycle of the monarch butterfly, and that they had agreed these were both very interesting topics. She asked Conrad on the 3rd morning if he knew how to skip stones, and he said he did, and they spent 45 minutes at the water's edge while Theodora sat on the porch with her manuscript and tried not to watch them. She watched them. She was writing again. Slowly, cautiously. The way you'd put weight on a leg you weren't sure had healed, but the words were moving again after months of nothing. She didn't examine this too closely. She'd learned that the act of writing was suspicious of observation, that if you looked at it directly, it stopped. What she did notice, in the peripheral way, she noticed everything she wasn't prepared to examine directly. He was quiet in a way that was different from her ex-husband's quiet. Marcus had been quiet when he was elsewhere, mentally when he'd decided the conversation didn't require him. Conrad was quiet in a way that was paying attention. She noticed, too, that he never asked her what she was working on. She noticed that he noticed she was grateful for this. On the 5th evening, the propane ran low and they discovered it at the same moment. The stove clicking uselessly, both of them standing in the kitchen, dinner half started. "There's a hardware store in town," he said. "Madigan's," she said. "On the main street, past the post office. Closes at 6. It's 5:40. They looked at each other. "I'll go," he said. "Willa's in the bath. I can't leave her. I know, I'll go." He was back in 22 minutes with 2 propane canisters and a paper bag from somewhere she didn't recognize. He set the canisters down, put the bag on the table. Inside, a small jar of local honey, 2 butter tarts from what the label said was the Dunmore's Landing Women's Institute Fall Bake Sale, and a drawing book for Willa that he'd apparently found in the general store beside Madigan's. He said nothing about any of it. He hooked up the propane and tested the burner and went back to his corner of the table. Theodora stood with the butter tart in her hand for a moment longer than was warranted. There was a woman in Dunmore's Landing named Mrs. Colette Brochu, who was, depending on who you asked, the postmistress, the de facto town historian, the person you called if your pipes froze, or your dock needed replanking, or you wanted to know something about this lake, and the families who'd summered on it for 3 generations. She was 70-something and small, and she wore the same style of hand-knit cardigan in varying colors, and she had opinions she shared freely and without apology. Theodora had met her on her 3rd day, when she'd walked into town with Willa for the mail. "You're in the Bellamy cabin, Mrs." Brochu had said, not as a question. She was sorting envelopes behind the counter with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. "Bex's cousin." "That's right. October's a good month up here. People think it's finished, but it isn't." She'd looked at Willa, who was examining a rack of tourist postcards with professional interest. "The child likes it?" "She does. Good. Children should spend time near water." She'd handed Theodora a small bundle of forwarded mail. "The dock has a softboard, 3rd one from the end. Step over it." Theodora had told her she already knew. Mrs. Brochu had smiled, briefly and with great satisfaction, as if that confirmed something. When Theodora went into town on the 7th day, after Conrad had arrived, and the world had reorganized itself without her permission, Mrs. Brochu looked up from her counter and said, "I see you have a visitor. Booking error," Theodora said. "Is that so?" The tone suggested Mrs. Brochu was filing this information under a different category than the one offered. "He has a valid confirmation. The agency made a mistake." More envelope sorting. "He came in himself, you know, day before yesterday, bought honey and butter tarts and asked where the trail to the ridge started." A pause. Polite. "Doesn't fill up the room." Theodora said nothing. "That's rarer than it sounds," Mrs. Brochu said. She slid a postcard across the counter, addressed to Willa, from Bex, a photograph of the Halifax waterfront. "Your friend sent this before you arrived. I was holding it." Theodora looked at the postcard. On the back, in Bex's handwriting, "Told you the cabin would fix things, or at least rearrange them." And then smaller. "Sometimes those are the same." She looked up. Mrs. Brochu was watching her with an expression that was either gentle or amused. From that face, at this distance, it was difficult to tell the difference. "How long have you known Bex's cousin?" Theodora asked. 30 years, Mrs. Brochu said. "He rented out to some people last autumn, and it didn't go well. He was very particular this year about who he accepted." She straightened her stack of envelopes with a sharp little tap against the counter. "So particular, in fact, that I'm sometimes surprised at the coincidences that crop up." Theodora stared at her. Mrs. Brochu's expression did not change. "You'll want to step carefully on that 3rd board," she said. "Though I imagine you know your way by now." She didn't tell Conrad what Mrs. Brochu had said. She turned it over for 2 days instead, carrying it the way you carry a thing that's too interesting and too fragile to examine all at once. The question that settled at the center of it was not whether it was true. She'd known Bex for 14 years. Bex had a belief, rarely stated and consistently demonstrated, that people were more competent at their own lives when they had the right conditions and occasionally a small, well-intentioned push. The postcard, she thought, was not accidental. Very few things with Bex were. The question was what it meant about the rest of it. She found herself going back over small things. The way he'd answered Willa's questions, that first morning, without performing patience, the way you only don't perform patience when it isn't an effort. The butter tarts. The fact that he'd been here 3 days before she knew he ran to the ridge trail. Because he'd mentioned it once, and she'd retained it without thinking. The way you retain things you're paying attention to against your will. She thought about what her character would do. She caught herself doing that more than she admitted, measuring real situations against the women she wrote, which was either a professional tic or something more embarrassing. And then she set that aside, because this was not a novel, and she was not allowed to skip to the parts that were clear. She went back to her manuscript. She wrote for 3 hours on the 9th day. She wrote for 4 on the 10th. On the 11th evening, the power went out. It happened at 8:15. Willa had gone to sleep an hour before. The cabin went dark and quiet all at once, and Theodora sat in the kitchen for a moment letting her eyes adjust, and then Conrad appeared in the doorway with his phone's flashlight. "Breaker box," he said, "porch, left of the door." He reset it twice. The power stayed out. He came back and she'd found the emergency candles in the drawer under the sink. She'd located them on day 2 as a matter of policy, and they lit 4 and put them on the kitchen table, and the room went warm and close and specific in the way that candlelit rooms do. They sat across from each other because it was the table, and there were chairs, and it was a kitchen. The geometry didn't leave a lot of choices. "What are you working on?" he asked. She looked up. He was watching the candle flame, not her, and she had the sense the question was deliberate in its timing, that he'd waited until the room made it easier. "A novel," she said. "My third. The second one did well enough that people are waiting for this one, which turns out to be a guaranteed way to not be able to write it." He was quiet for a moment. And now it's moving again." She paused. "I don't know why. I'm not asking." He looked up then, and the thing she'd been peripherally aware of for 11 days was suddenly direct. The quality of his attention, specific and unhurried, as if she were worth taking time over. "I think you probably know why," he said. She thought of the birches, of the ridge trail, 40 minutes up and 40 back, of Willa's drawing taped crookedly to the fridge. "Maybe," she said. He picked up the closest candle and turned it in his hands, watching the flame adjust. "I work in acquisitions," he said. "Corporate. I buy things, companies, assets." He set the candle back down. "I came here because my assistant told me I hadn't taken a vacation in 3 years, and then she booked it, and then she resigned, which I understand was not unrelated." Theodora looked at him. What was her name? Pamela. A small pause. Pamela Ngozi. She had been trying, in various ways, to tell me something for approximately 2 of those 3 years. I was not, in her words, a very good listener, and now you're on a lake in northern Ontario, in a cabin I apparently share with a novelist and a 7-year-old, who knows more about monarch butterflies than I ever expected to know. Something shifted in the corner of his mouth. It was the closest she'd seen to a smile. Pamela was right, I needed it. Theodora thought about Bex, about the postcard, about the 30-year relationship between a postmistress and a property owner, and the very particular word coincidences, and the specific and knowing way Mrs. Brochu had not smiled when she said it. "Can I tell you something strange?" she said. Yes. She told him what Mrs. Brochu had said. All of it, Beck's cousin being particular, the coincidences, the small sharp tap of the envelope stack against the counter. She told him about Bex and her belief in conditions and small pushes. She left the postcard out of it. Some things you hold back not because they're private, but because the moment isn't ready for them yet. Conrad listened. He did not interrupt or redirect. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she thought he might decide not to respond. And then he said, "My assistant resigned by leaving an envelope on my desk. Inside was her letter of resignation, 2 printouts of cabin listings, and a post-it note that said the second one." Theodora stared at him. "Lot 14C, Raven Lake Road," he said. That was the second listing. The candle between them guttered in a draft from somewhere, neither of them moved. "So," Theodora said. "So," he said. "This was engineered. By at least 2 people," he said. "Possibly 3, if your friend was coordinating with Mrs. Brochu." "Bex absolutely was coordinating with Mrs. Brochu," Theodora said. "I say that with complete certainty and zero surprise." He made a sound that was unambiguously, this time, a laugh, low and short but real. She felt it the way you feel a change in the weather, not as a specific sensation, but as a shift in the whole quality of the air. "The question," he said when it had passed, "is whether we're offended by it." Theodora considered the question seriously, because it deserved to be considered seriously. She thought about the manuscript, the 4 hours she'd written on the 10th day, the words that had come back after months of nothing. She thought about Willa on the dock, the patient explanation about wolf navigation, the drawing book left on the kitchen table without comment. She thought about a woman in a hand-knit cardigan who did not quite smile and did not quite explain, and had handed her a postcard that said sometimes those are the same. "I think I'm mostly just embarrassed," she said, "that I didn't figure it out sooner. You had a manuscript to finish. I had a manuscript I couldn't start, and now—" She looked at the candle. The power was still out. The lake outside was very dark and very quiet, and somewhere on the far bank the birches were standing in that darkness, gold inside them, patient. "And now it's starting," she said. "I told you I wasn't asking why." "You're not asking," he said. "That's different from not knowing." She looked at him across the table. The candlelight did something particular to the careful arrangement of his face, softened it, or maybe revealed what had always been underneath the arrangement, the thing the controlled expression was covering, not because it was unwanted, but because it was undefended. "I know," she said, quietly. "I just needed it to be allowed to be true before I said it out loud." He nodded. He understood this. She could see that he understood it precisely, not approximately, and that was the thing she would think about later, in the warm and ordinary days that followed. Not any single moment, but the accumulation of being understood precisely instead of approximately over and over, in the way that makes you realize you'd been settling for approximate for a very long time. The power came back at 10 o'clock. They both blinked in the sudden brightness. Theodora laughed. surprised out of it, short and involuntary, and Conrad looked at her when she laughed, and that too she would think about later. She blew out the candles. He went to check the breaker box one more time, out of what she recognized as professional thoroughness, the habit of verifying what you already know. She put the kettle on. When he came back, she had 2 mugs out. In the morning, Willa came downstairs and found them both at the kitchen table. She at the center table with her manuscript, he at his corner with his laptop, and said, with 7-year-old assurance, "You seem different." "We're the same," Theodora said. Willa looked at Conrad. Is she telling the truth? Conrad considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Mostly, he said. Willa appeared satisfied. She got her cereal. She reported that she had dreamed about monarch butterflies, and that in the dream they had all been wearing tiny hats, which she felt was significant, though she wasn't sure how. Conrad said he thought it was probably significant in the best possible way. Willow agreed. Theodora watched this and wrote nothing for 20 minutes and didn't mind at all. On the last morning, his not hers, she had 4 days left and had already decided not to leave early. She was on the dock when he came down from the ridge trail. Willa was still asleep. The lake was flat and pewter and very still. The birches on the far bank lit up in the early sun, October doing what it had been doing all month, being more than people expected. He came down to the dock and stopped at the end of the gravel, looked at her sitting there with her feet above the water. "Third board," she said, without turning around. "I know," he said. He stepped over it and came to stand beside her. They sat in that silence for a while. The particular silence of people who have found the specific frequency of each other and don't feel the need to fill it. "I'm going to call Pamela," he said finally. "When I get back, to rehire her, to thank her. The rehiring is a separate conversation." A pause. She deserves to know she was right. Theodora thought of Mrs. Brochu in her hand-knit cardigan, sorting envelopes with the precision of someone who has been right about things for a very long time and has made peace with being right quietly. She thought of Bex in Halifax, almost certainly checking the weather in Sudbury on her phone. "I'll write to Bex tonight," Theodora said. "What will you tell her?" She looked out at the birches. The gold was at its peak. Another few days and it would start to come down, leaf by leaf, until the branches were bare and the light came through differently. She had learned this month to stop being disappointed by things ending and start paying attention to them while they were happening. It was harder than it sounded. She was still learning. "I'll tell her the cabin fixed things," she said. He was quiet for a moment, or rearranged them. She looked at him. He was watching the lake, profile toward her, and she thought that she had written men like this. She had tried to write men like this, and that the thing you couldn't put on the page was the ordinary weight of them, the specific gravity of a person sitting beside you in the morning light, real and unhurried and present. "Same thing sometimes," she said. He turned to look at her. He smiled. Fully this time, no approximation, and it was so different from the controlled face she'd first seen across the gravel drive that she felt it like the birches must feel the light, something turning toward warmth from the inside out. "Same thing," he agreed. The lake held still. The birches held their gold a little longer. Willa's window opened above them, and her small face appeared, and she said without preamble, "Is breakfast happening or not?" And Theodora laughed, and Conrad laughed, and they got up off the dock and went inside. And that was how it started, not with a grand declaration or a cinematic moment, but with breakfast and a child in socks on the stairs. And the light coming through the window, the way October light comes through, when you've finally stopped waiting for it to be something other than what it is.